The cafe that only opens on windy days. The cafe did not announce itself. There was no neon sign, no window display, no scent of baking bread carried to the street. It existed quietly, almost invisibly, tucked between two older buildings whose bricks had darkened with rain and smoke. Its door was worn, the paint pale from sun and storm, hinges whispering whenever the wind nudged it open. And it opened only when the wind arrived with insistence, rattling the streets, bending trees, and lifting leaves into restless spirals. She had discovered it by accident on a morning when the air was sharp, steel-brushed, and her coat flared around her ankles with every gust. She had meant only to walk, to let the wind move through her and shake the stillness from her chest. But when the door appeared, slightly ajar, she paused. Inside was a dim warmth, muted light spilling across tables, the smell of coffee rich and earthy, with something sweet, almost imperceptible, hidden in the aroma. She entered. The bell above the door jingled softly. The cafe was empty, save for the counter at the back and a single chair by the window. Dust motes danced in the stray rays of light that had followed her inside. It was quiet in a way that made her chest unclench, a quiet that seemed to draw the wind's chaos into itself and reshape it into stillness. From that day on, she returned whenever the wind was restless. Sometimes the gusts came unexpectedly, rattling windows and scattering old leaves, and the cafe would open, welcoming her as if it had been waiting. Other days she anticipated the wind, watching the sky, feeling it tug at her scarf, and knew the door would swing wide once more. The cafe itself seemed alive. Walls were lined with photographs in mismatched frames, capturing corners of streets she had never visited, small gatherings of strangers, and the occasional photograph of a man holding an umbrella in the rain, his back to the lens. Books were stacked along shelves, dog-eared and worn, titles she recognized and others she did not. Each object carried a subtle invitation to notice, to remember, to linger. She settled into her chair by the window, the one that had first welcomed her. It became her anchor, a place from which the world could be observed without intrusion. Through the glass, she watched the wind move across the town, bending branches, tossing paper along the streets, carrying the scent of distant rain. Inside, the cafe felt suspended, caught between the gusts and the quiet that followed them. Time passed differently there. Hours stretched, softened, and became almost tangible. The kettle boiled somewhere behind the counter, cups clinked gently on saucers, steam rose from coffee in delicate spirals. She imagined the presence of those who had sat there before her, strangers whose hands had rested on the same wood, whose glances had brushed the window, leaving traces almost invisible, yet tangible in the atmosphere. Occasionally, others arrived. A man with a scarf loose around his neck, a woman carrying a small package, an older couple whose hands brushed as they moved past her table. None spoke, none acknowledged her. Yet the cafe held them all, folding their presence into its rhythm, shaping the air with their quiet stories. Seasons moved with the wind, each leaving subtle marks. Winter brought snow drifting through the streets and cinnamon in the air. Spring smelled of rain on cobblestones, distant birdsong, the freshness of early blooms. Summer was warm, golden, and soft beneath her palms. Autumn arrived with the tang of wet soil, leaves swirling like dancers, the wind compelling the cafe doors to open and welcome her in again. She carried a small notebook, sketching the windows, the tables, the angles of light on cups, the drifting curtains. Some pages remained blank, waiting for the unformed, the fleeting. Others filled with fragments of memory, details of mornings and afternoons, movements and reflections she could not capture elsewhere. Each sketch became a quiet act of holding on to impermanence, of noticing the impermanent beauty of this secret place. And then, one particularly gusty afternoon, the cafe seemed different. She entered and settled into her usual chair. The wind rattled against the windows with unusual insistence. Steam rose from her coffee, but she sensed a subtle tension in the space, a rhythm slightly off from the familiar cadence of arrivals and departures. Her gaze drifted across the room. And then she saw him. He sat at a corner table, hunched slightly over a notebook, fingers moving across its surface in careful, precise patterns. His scarf was loose, the wind catching it occasionally, brushing against his coat. She did not need to search his face to know the tilt of his shoulders, the faint curve of his hairline, the rhythm of his hands. It was him, though years had passed. He did not see her. He looked past her, immersed in some private world, unaware of the quiet recognition that had blossomed in her chest. She remained in her chair, neither moving closer nor drawing attention. The cafe hummed softly around them, the creak of chairs, the whisper of wind against glass, the faint clink of cups. She traced the steam from her coffee, felt its warmth seep through her palms, watched the sunlight drift across the table. Time slowed, drawn taut with memory and the unspoken. She remembered mornings they had spent together, streets walked in laughter and silence alike, hands brushing, glances held too long or too short. She felt the ghost of the past settle lightly across her shoulders, a presence she could carry without pain. For a long while, she watched him. The tilt of his head, the gentle tapping of fingers on paper, the way his gaze lingered on lines she would never read. He did not look up. He did not notice her. And in that absence, she felt the full weight of remembrance, the ache, yes, but also the quiet relief of closure. Some things, she realized, exist only to be remembered, held in secret, carried gently in one's chest. When the wind shifted and rustled the door, she finally turned back to the window. Outside, leaves danced in spirals, lifted high and carried away. Inside, the cafe seemed to exhale, settling around her, absorbing the echoes of the moment and the faint trace of him. She sipped her coffee, letting its warmth fill the spaces where memory and absence met. The encounter lasted only minutes, yet it left her full, light, and strangely at peace. The cafe was not simply a refuge from wind or weather, but a place where the past could meet the present without harm, where recognition and invisibility could coexist, and where a silent goodbye could exist without words, explanation, or expectation. She stayed until the light faded completely, until the last visitor had left, until shadows deepened into quiet darkness. Then she rose, gathered her coat, and stepped into the night. The door closed softly behind her, bell chiming once, and the cafe settled into its own rhythm, waiting for the next gust of wind. Outside, the street was quiet. Leaves tumbled along the asphalt. Somewhere, unseen, the man continued his work, unaware of her presence, unaware of the recognition that had passed silently. And she walked home, carrying only the memory, the warmth of coffee, the touch of wind, and the knowledge that closure can arrive quietly, without acknowledgement, without words, but in full, in its own subtle, persistent way. Seasons continued to pass. She returned whenever the wind insisted, her notebook filling with sketches and fragments of thought. And each time, the cafe held her presence, her solitude, and the faint echo of him, quietly, imperceptibly, in its warm, shadowed air. Eventually, she understood something she had not before, that life is measured not in arrivals or departures, in recognition or reunion, but in the spaces between, in the silent threads that connect us, in the patient observation of impermanence. The cafe, the wind, the forgotten glances, all of it existed not for grand gestures or closure through words, but for the small, quiet endurance of memory, held gently in the heart. She left the cafe that evening with her notebook under her arm, the wind still whispering along the streets, carrying leaves, carrying the faint echo of her past and of lives intersecting. The door closed behind her with a soft chime, the cafe settling into the waiting again, ready for the next gust, ready for her return, and ready to hold all that arrived and all that passed unseen. And in that waiting, she carried the truth that some connections endure not because they are acknowledged, not because they are spoken, but because they are remembered, quietly, persistently, and entirely, in the spaces between one step and the next.